Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the fifth episode of Content Intelligence, a BrightTALK series where we'll be exploring the process to create engaging, high-performing content from a data-driven perspective. My name is Nick Markwith, and I've spent the past 9 years producing hundreds of virtual events, series, and online presentations with our clients to better connect with their audience through streaming content to build trust with their audience and resonate with their target audience. Before we get started, I wanted to remind the audience that we're live and interactive, and we want to hear your questions and feedback. Please submit your questions throughout the player and at any time, and we'll take them throughout today's talk and at the very end if we have time. And without further ado, let's jump into what we'll be covering today. In today's episode, we'll be discussing content analytics, the data, the metrics, the goals needed to really understand how you and your content is performing against your targets and KPIs. We're going to start by looking at the relationship between goals and metrics and how selecting the right metric really depends on understanding the relationship of what you're trying to measure and what you're trying to gain out of your measurement. And so we'll be talking a little bit more about how to what are kind of common goals we typically see around content analytics, and we'll start digging into specifically what metrics we use, as well as metrics we recommend a lot of our clients use when measuring content. From there, we'll start talking about the different types of content analytics. There are a number of different ways in which you can measure performance, effectiveness, and efficiency, and it's important that you are looking at certain metrics, metrics that you have available, but also the metrics that matter. And so we'll be talking a little bit more about, what metrics you can be looking at now with what you have accessible, as well as what metrics you should be aiming to measure down the line. And then finally, we'll just have some tips around getting started. How do you pick the right metrics and right goals in order to achieve what your targets? And so we're talking a little bit more about how to settle on the right metrics, and some best practices we've seen at BrightTALK. And without further ado, let's get started. So as I mentioned, choosing the right goal is crucial in order for you to understand what metrics you should be choosing. Without a goal in mind and without generally a purpose, it's going to be really tough for you to settle on which metric you should be optimizing for, which metric you should be reporting back to your board, and just what you should be caring about. Because there is a lot of data out there. And oftentimes I see a lot of clients struggling because they're overwhelmed by the amount of data out there that could be measuring and exploring and giving importance to. But not all data is created equally. And while some data is extremely useful, some other data isn't, and oftentimes can lead you in the wrong direction. And so, choosing the right goal is crucial in order for you to understand what metrics you need to be monitoring and measuring and optimizing for, quite honestly. Before we jump into that, I want to talk a little bit more about content analytics. Content analytics, also called content intelligence, is really the measurement and analysis of how your audience is engaging and interacting with your content and how they found your content. It really is the kind of a foundational part of any data-driven marketer who needs to understand, which channels are performing best in order to understand which segments of your customers are engaging with which content, which pieces of content are influencing throughout the customer and buyer's journey. All of these questions are necessary. Data is necessary, metrics are necessary in order to answer these questions. And so, but in order to get started, you really, like I said, you really need to decide on the right goals. You need to know what you're trying to be optimizing for, what you need to be reporting on, what's making the biggest impact, what matters to you, to your business, to your organization. I see a lot, very commonly, I'll see a lot of marketers out there, being measured by lead volume, leads created, right? You need to have a certain flow of leads in order to be feeding your sales team in order to make sure that you're generating results. I also see a lot of other marketers, being measured by revenue. How they impact the bottom line and drive results, is coming more and more common. And so, depending on whether your business is setting which targets and KPIs are important, or if you have to set them yourself, you really need to make sure you are understanding, what it is that matters most. And it's okay if you don't know. Now, this whole process isn't a one-time process. This is an ongoing process that requires, measurement, optimization, revisions, and going back and improving over time. But once you have decided on the right goals, you do need to decide what can you and can't track. Like I said before, there is a lot of data out there, and we'll cover quite a few different data points today. Some of them are pretty standard, and quite honestly should be what most marketers can capture. There are more advanced metrics. There are a number of metrics that BrightTALK is still trying to capture because it's tough. It requires a lot of the right inputs in order for you to be able to look at the outputs. And so, understanding what you can and can't track, what tools you have available, and therefore what data you have available, will really kind of set the tone as well as with your goals on what you can and can't do with data. From there, it's really just tracking and measuring the data. Whether it's a tool you have yourself, whether it's a dashboard, whether it's a spreadsheet you keep up to date, understanding and tracking on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, quarterly basis is important. You need to understand trends and analysis so that you can make the right decisions. And so, understanding and really have a baseline. And we'll talk about a little bit about this later about benchmarking yourself against historical data you own, as well as against industry data, because it's important for you to understand how well you are doing. And this is what the whole point around content analytics is doing, is showing how well you are doing, how well the content's doing, and how much impact the content's having on the bottom line. Lastly, turning information into actionable insights. Data is only as good as the insights are generated from it. And so, I see a lot of times where a lot of marketers and just, business people in general are reporting around metrics, but people get overwhelmed because it's just information. Information's not useful unless there is some kind of actionable insight you can gain from it. Great. We're seeing that, that certain content formats are underperforming in terms of lead creation. Great. Well, why? Now let's look into the data and figure out why, and make business decisions from it. The whole point around content analytics is to inform you around what to do next and how to optimize and what is being successful and what's not being successful. And so it's really important to be looking at you really looking at what the metrics are saying and how that translates into actual insights. And then finally, optimizing, reporting, and strategizing. This is the end result. You're likely going to be optimizing in some way, whether it's a campaign, whether it's a piece of content. You're likely reporting this data, whether to the board, to your boss, to the business itself, or you're making decisions and strategizing from this data. But really, you're doing one of the three things with this data in order to understand how to move forward and create the best content possible. Before we get into the data, I do want to talk a little bit more about content formats, purpose, and goals, because they are inherently tied together. So, the goal in which you're trying to achieve, there are many different types of goals out there. I'm going to cover, a few common ones in a second. But there is a relationship between the content format and that purpose and goal. So on the right side here, you'll see a content matrix, which identifies, kind of the different purposes each content format tends to have. So as an example, competitions, games, and branded videos tend to be more of an entertainment approach. It's not really providing any business value, but it is grabbing their attention. Inspirational content, similar, right? Grabbing their attention, but probably with a little bit more kind of rational purchase decision making. So reviews, for example, someone might get inspired by a review about how this tool or service has improved their infrastructure or business, but it's further along in terms of purchasing. Same thing with convince, right? There are a lot of, probably the vast majority of content is trying to convince and persuade, your potential leads and potential buyers to buy your product. And so there are definitely certain formats that lean towards more convincing and persuading than there is towards, say, educating, things like guides and trend boards and press releases. And so, the reason why I'm saying this is because depending on that purpose and that goal, your metrics that you decide to measure that of this content by is going to differ. And so, how I measure competition is going to be different than how I measure a webinar, which is how I'm different than an ebook versus a demo request and just a product demo. And so, understanding that you can't measure all content the same way or expect all the same results across content formats or even potentially within certain content, right? So it's important for that you are tracking and measuring so that when you do create a baseline, you're creating a baseline from your own product or from your own content, as well as some industry, external industry benchmarking as well. But it is extremely important you understand this content format and this and purpose and goal relationship. So it's important for you to be aware. But let's move on to goals. Because really, data and goals really equal actionable insights. And so, you're really only as good as the goals and the metrics that you choose. Because there are a lot of metrics out there that you can use in order to measure a lot of different things. But really, settling on the right metrics and really, not too many metrics is the goal here. And so, but in terms of common goals we typically see with content, I typically see really three main goals. There is some, nuance within these, but within these three goals, it's really the first and probably one of the most important ones is attracting and inspiring new audiences. So your content, part of your goal of your content is to try and to reach new audiences, identify the unknown to known, and really start getting them as part of your content marketing process and your nurture flow. And so, understanding, so getting content out there that's just meant to get people interested in you and your brand. So very much brand awareness would fall underneath this common goal, as well as just lead creation in general. But it's very high level. And so, oftentimes we'll see content that is more thought leadership based. It might be more entertainment or inspirational because all it's meant is to capture contact information. It's not meant to necessarily persuade. It's not necessarily meant to educate, but it is meant to definitely capture their content or capture their contact information. Another goal I see, which is not surprising, is that once you have captured those audiences, you need to keep them informed and engaged. You want to make sure that you are building a relationship with your leads. People don't buy very transactionally anymore, especially when it comes to larger purchasing decisions. And so it's really important that you consistently keep your lead database warm and make sure that you're sending out content, whether it's newsletters, informing them about updates, educational, whatever the content format is, but keeping them warm until they're ready to buy, and really sending out content that might be pushing them further down the funnel or closer to consideration and evaluation content. So it's really important that you keep your audiences engaged by nurture through content. And then finally, persuading audiences to action. This is the call to action. This is the persuasion conversion content. This is your best attempt to convince someone to go buy your product through your content. And so, the tone, the format, their approach to convincing someone is going to be significantly different than your approach to someone that you're trying to attract. Now, I say that there's these three goals. There is overlap, and I will say that content formats can do multiple goals. For example, I mentioned previously, I'm going to jump back. I mentioned previously that webinars are convince and purchase content, and they're pretty far down in terms of emotional versus rational and purchase versus awareness. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think webinars are a format, and you can, depending on how you approach the content, you can have it be more purchase related, or you can have it be very discussion oriented and very much about inspiring and entertaining, or really educating. So just because there is certain goals in certain formats and they tend to be highly correlated, it doesn't mean that they fall cleanly into one bucket or not another. Now, in terms of, we've talked a little bit about goals and setting the goals. Really your goals and what you choose in terms of your goals depends on really your organization. And it really depends on what is important to really your CEO, your CMO, the business, what you need to report on, as well as really where you might be struggling, right? This is why measuring and tracking is so important. If lead volume isn't an issue, but converting by MQL creation or conversion is, then you need to potentially change your goals. If you're being asked to report on how much revenue is being generated per asset, that's going to require quite a bit of data beforehand in order for you to report on that. So it's incredibly important for you to know kind of what your goal is and then understand which data points are related to it. And so what we'll be going over next are different data points that I have seen covered across a lot of content marketers. There are really four different types. I've kind of bucketed into 4 different types of content of analytics. One around production and how you produce content and the efficiency you produce within that process. It will also cover metrics around engagement, probably the chunkiest part of this, but how your audience is interacting with the content, how they're engaging with it, and how much reach you're getting from your content are all important aspects you need to be looking at. Further down in terms of business impact, there are things around attribution and how content influences a buyer. There isn't. You'll find that there isn't going to be a single piece of content that is the attraction content or the converting content. You'll probably find that demos are likely your highest converting content, but that isn't necessarily the case. And so you want to make sure that you are understanding how content influences buyers and in what order. And so we'll talk a little bit more about attribution, first touch, last touch, and multi-touch. And then finally, there is metrics around performance, right? The business impact on the bottom line. So understanding what metrics ultimately you need to be optimizing for that is impacting the business, whether it's anything from lead creation and volume to lead quality, MQLs, sales accepted leads, all the way to booking pipeline contribution and revenue contribution. So there are a number of different metrics that tell us different things. And so what we're going over is each of these 4 different metrics, some of the examples of these metrics, and how a lot of marketers use these in terms of where you can get started and kind of some more advanced metrics going forward. So first off, production metrics. Production metrics really tells you, how efficiently you are creating content, and really the cost behind you creating content. A lot of this is related to, the resource being put in versus the output. But part of this is a setup for going into ROI, as you'll see at the very bottom. But this is all around kind of the goal around 2 things: telling you how efficiently you are at creating content, and therefore how much resources are needed to be put in to produce each piece of content. The other part is also just managing production. Identifying, bottlenecks within your process and workflow, or understanding, and managing performance of your content creators. It's extremely important that as marketers, that you're creating content on a consistent basis, and that we hit deadlines that are reasonable, and that we are producing content on that consistent basis. And so it's important that you understand kind of those two aspects in order to manage your team and your content creators, whether they're internal or external, or understand how much is it costing to produce different content formats, so that you can understand, is it worth to create certain content. And really how I've thought about a lot of these metrics is that you really need to start with what you have access to, and we'll talk about this in a little bit later. But and so how I've organized this is the metrics go from top to bottom, from kind of what tends to be most accessible to most marketers, down to kind of more advanced metrics. Metrics that I see some very sophisticated marketers using in order to measure the performance of campaigns, of content, down to individual assets. But let's go over this a little bit. So resource cost, not surprising, but the cost to create content. You can't understand ROI without understanding how much cost it is to create content, to create the piece of content. Creating a video is going to be very different than creating a blog post versus creating a webinar. There are different costs associated with it, whether it is you actually creating the content or even promoting the content. There's a cost in order for you to get that content out there, and you need to understand that, so that you can be measuring and understanding where you're getting the most bang for your buck. Time to publish, right? How efficiently are you creating content? The length of time needs to create that content. This gives you a baseline so that you can manage performance. So if you see that certain content formats take 3 months, you can plan that out appropriately. You can also see when people are publishing on time, and manage the production accordingly. On-time delivery rate, not surprisingly, is definitely a performance management metric. So looking at how often content is delivered on time against deadline, is key to making sure that your team is a well-oiled machine and operating at a high level. And so what content is delivered and at what time is important. Content coverage, and this does require you organizing and categorizing your content in different ways, whether it's through pillar clusters, or topic pillars, or topic clusters, but really understanding what topics are being covered, tying those topics to performance and audience engagement, so that you understand how many content assets you have per topic, how well each topic's performing, and really the shelf life of some of the content. Because quite honestly, you want to really double down on what's performing well in terms of content. You also make sure you have enough spread, especially related to what keywords and SEO is being driven to your website. So it's really important to have kind of this visibility especially in terms of planning. Production cost. This is really kind of the total cost to get something from ideation all the way to publication and promotion. So I would say similar to resource cost, but this includes distribution of content, and really any other costs associated in order to get that content out there. So including tool costs, external, internal resources, anything along those lines, in order to measure. And then finally, content ROI, return on investment based on direct or influence bookings. So a lot of marketers are being asked to measure revenue, and so while that tends to be more of a performance metric, I have seen a number of marketers being asked to report on investment per asset, or ROI per asset, or ROI per content format. Again, interesting in terms of reporting to the board. Interesting in terms of understanding the impact each content format has, and it's just an interesting way to look at how much money you're inputting, how much money you're getting output. There are a few clients I have seen that really do a really great job at tracking this down to the individual, cents and dollars, but it's very hard and it requires a lot of work in order to get there. It's not somewhere there where BrightTALK is at. Actually, we're still working towards getting some of these metrics. Engagement. I think this is probably one of the biggest, and probably one of the things that marketers think of most outside of performance. But how your audience is resonating and interacting with your content, and how they found your content, are all really important metrics to be exploring. So I've split engagement into kind of two different buckets. There's this idea around reaching your audience, right? So there are metrics around kind of volumes of traffic, of registrations and views, just general how much your brand is getting out there. Oftentimes, brand awareness will fall underneath this with the contributor goals. But oftentimes this is the easiest thing to measure, right? Hopefully most people have Google Analytics. And so you can measure page traffic. You can look at conversion rates. You can look at time on page. And so, but totals give you the reach, but that doesn't give you the full story. You can, just because you reach someone and got them to a page doesn't mean they actually are engaged. It means that you got their initial interest. And so engagement is the other side of this coin. And so looking at how certain users are engaging with what you send them, and really focusing on their behavior. Okay, so kind of how I differentiate kind of audience reach and engagement is, reach is all about who you're reaching, by which channel, by totals, and kind of tends to be more higher level, sometimes a little bit more vanity metrics. It tends to be more about just, is your brand interacting with the right audiences and a certain volume of audience. It doesn't really tell you, it tells you a certain level of interest. It doesn't tell you really a lot about content quality. It's or really kind of the depth of interest of your audience. And so really these two types of metrics need to go together in order to tell you kind of a fuller picture. But impressions and page traffic are important to know. I mean, these are pretty cornerstone metrics where you're looking at how many times your brand got sent in front of a person, and how many times someone came to your website. Those are important, because it tells you just overall arching totals and just volumes. Because if you don't have enough volume, you're not going to get any conversions. Registrations and views for webinars, I put underneath this bucket. How many people you're reaching with each piece of content is great. But if you're reaching 1,000 people and only 10 of them fit your ideal customer profile, then I don't know if that's a successful webinar, right? So this is why there's this kind of this balance between this volume and quantity, quantity and quality, and kind of balance between the two. Followers, subscribers, how many people found your content valuable enough in order to continue following you for future content? Signups for your newsletter would be another one. These are all ways for you to be able to reach, but it doesn't tell you kind of how interested they are. New versus returning. How many people are net new to you versus how many audience members are returning, known users that you've already engaged. Are you reaching new users? Or are you not? Because you need to have both an inflow of net new contacts. You need to have a database that's continually warmed, that is going to be, feeding your sales team by going through their buyer journey down to more converting content. And then share of voice is one of the things I'm seeing more and more. You'll see this a lot in social media content, or social media in particular. This is a lot about brand mentions within a social network. And so, this also compares you against your competitors. It's a nice, interesting benchmark report, or a benchmarking metric that allows you to understand how are you doing against your competitors in certain spaces? Are you getting your brand out there in the right way? And how well are you doing against your peers? I do find that audience reach is very important, because if you don't have the volume, you're not going to get ultimately the volume of conversions you need. A lot of sales and marketing is a volumes game, but with the volume of data that we do have, the amount of data that we do have, we can be smarter about who is the most engaged, right? Just because we're reaching more audiences doesn't tell us the full picture. And so understanding how your audience is engaging with your content and looking at how they find the content through say email metrics, for example, all the way to time on page is often a very common metric I see, right, in order to determine effectiveness of content, are all good and interesting. These are also highly accessible to you. These are assets these are data points that you have accessible, because you probably are sending emails, and you likely have a website. And so these tend to be the two basic ones that tend to inform a lot of our marketers' strategy. But I think there are a lot more interesting metrics that tell you kind of deeper interest and intent. Viewing duration is one of them. Obviously, with webinars and videos, this is a very important one. But how long someone viewed the content for is important. And understanding, right, that depending on the state of which someone is viewing the content, so whether it's live or if it's on demand, it's going to have slightly different experiences. So live events have higher viewing durations. I'll cover completion rates in a second. They also have higher completion rates, because people who make the effort and are available to attend live will view 92% of the content. It's because they're there. They're there to ask questions. They're there to listen and learn. They have the time and they're willing to attend. But a vast majority of people actually don't want to attend live. We've been seeing it through our benchmark report, and there is actually a link to that in our attachments today. But we're finding that there's a shift from a lot of professionals from, if they're able to attend live and it's a really interesting topic, an interesting professional or presenter, they will try and make it. But really, how they want their preference for learning and their availability are really the key factors in terms of if someone attends live versus on demand and the recorded version. And with the recorded version, we see a much lower volume of completion rate and viewing duration. It's only about 22 minutes, right? It's also because the format, right? Live webinars, you can't fast forward. You can't jump into the middle of it. You have to listen to the beginning and the intro and listen to or leave, right? With videos and on-demand webinars, you have the ability to jump to different parts. And so we do see that behavior quite a bit, but we do see a lot of people viewing the content on demand and wanting to view it on demand. But looking at viewing duration is interesting, but viewing duration is also dependent on the length of your content. I would also say viewing duration could be, actually I'll cover that for completion rate. So viewing duration is interesting. It tells you something, but it actually doesn't tell you the full picture, because depending on the content format, it really can change quite dramatically. I think something a little bit more interesting is audience interactions. And when I say interactions, I'm talking about things like sharing, liking content, commenting, and feedback, asking questions. I say within kind of this universe, I would say that probably likes is the most common, as well as shares. I actually don't find those. Those are interesting metrics, but I find those to be a little bit more vanity metrics at times. Someone has shown and liked them, but a like can be cheap. It's easy to do. It doesn't take a lot. And if someone likes your brand, they might like your content regardless. So it can only go so much and tell you so much. Shares, a little bit more interesting. Someone who is sharing your content has decided that your content is interesting, valuable enough, or or something that they want to show someone else. And that's quite a bit of intent. But why they share, can range. It could be because they found it valuable. It could be because they want to share and repost on social in order to leverage your content as a curated piece of content. It could be that they just start sharing without any context, because it's not hard to do. It's relatively easy to share things nowadays because of all the social sharing buttons that we have. But where I find some audience interaction, data more interesting is really along the lines of questions as well as comments. And so, questions tends to be a little bit more related to webinars and kind of live events. But someone who asks a question, is showing obviously a high level of engagement. They've been listening. They have something they want to learn from you about, and they think you might have an answer. So, when your leads do ask questions, I would definitely prioritize that data. But I will put a little caveat with questions that not everyone likes to ask questions, and nor does everyone can ever attend live presentation. So the opportunity to ask questions, as well as just the likelihood of people asking questions, tends to be on the lower side. I think a recent analysis I did showed, I think roughly about 10 to 20% of users ask questions live. It's not a lot, but those who do like attending live and do like asking questions will ask a lot of questions. Again, it's preferences. And what you're looking out for are these people are preferences and weighting, the cues that they're giving you. Finally, comments I think is probably the most interesting and probably the most valuable, I'd say. A lot of times you'll get a lot of comments that are negative or a lot of comments that are just spam. But someone who reads your article, your blog, who listens to your presentation, processes it and provides feedback, provides their own commentary, shows that they listened, they thought about it, and now they're responding and taking action. The amount of effort it takes in order to ask or to provide comments or even ask questions is a lot higher than liking something or sharing something. And that's why I think there's this nuance here where if you can capture comments and if you can capture questions and feedback, these are really powerful indicators of interest. It isn't the go-to. It isn't it tells you the whole story, but it tells you some interesting parts of the story. Registration to view conversion. This is very specifically to kind of events. So this is all about measuring how many people registered for your event. This could be in person or it could be or online, and number of those professionals and leads who actually attended the content or attended the physical event. So getting someone to sign up for a webinar, isn't overly tough. If the content's valuable, seems interesting, and it's relevant to who you promoted it to, you'll probably get a registration. It is much harder though, because the registration again is a click. They've probably maybe read a minute or two tops of what the content is, and they've decided that they want to potentially attend. Registrations aren't promises to attend. They are some initial interest. That's why it's really important that when you do get that registration, you don't do it too early so people forget, but you also don't forget to remind people. People forget, and if you promote things too far out in advance, they'll forget. And if there's no reminders, right, they won't attend. But really understanding excuse me, let me start again. When you are looking at these registrations, and those who have shown enough interest and have enough interest in your content to actually go and then view your content, I think it shows a significant amount of intent that you can rely on in terms of showing which content is valuable. I specifically put registration to view versus registration to live view. A lot of our clients like to measure, right, how many people, there's 100 people attending our webinar, and how many people are going to attend live. Our average is about 36% to about 40%, give or take, for live attendance. But that isn't, and I was saying earlier, that isn't the best metric, because just because someone couldn't attend live doesn't mean that they aren't going to attend on demand or recorded. And so, and quite honestly, someone who can't attend live can easily have been, something came up, they got too busy. Doesn't mean they're not interested and won't view it. So focus on live as much as you have, live presenters, and you really want to make sure that the live presenter has a live audience, right? No one wants to speak to an empty room. In terms of measuring content quality, registration to view, meaning registration to either viewing it live or recorded after registering, really shows, one, it's a two-step process. They've registered and then they viewed. It just shows a lot higher intent. It tends to be one of the metrics we use to measure content quality. Did your content have enough pull to bring them back after registering initially, to bring them back to view it again? Part of this is a promotion aspect to it, right? If you don't remind people about it, send them an email after. If they don't attend, they won't view it. But it's also important to, it is an important metric to look at. Scroll depth, this is related to kind of time on page, but a little more advanced. But this looks at how your leads are interacting with your page. So are they outside just time on page, and what are they doing? Are they scrolling down? Are they clicking things? Oftentimes it's a heat map at times. So you see really how your users are and your leads are behaving on your website, and what they are doing. Because if you spend a lot, if you leave the most value of your content at the very end of your, most value at the very end of your content, and someone doesn't even scroll down to it, they're missing out on the best part. And so there is this balance here of understanding, great, you got them on the page, got them to stay on the page. Now, what did they do on the page? It's an interesting metric to understand, what is effective, especially around web design and content. And completion rate. Completion rate was something I've been focusing on more and more lately. And the completion rate is the amount of time someone has spent against a piece of content against the potential amount of time. So for webinars, this is probably the cleanest way to measure it. For webinars, if a webinar is 60 minutes long and they viewed it for 45 minutes, they have viewed 75% of the content, right? 3/4 of the content. And so this takes away the length of your content as a factor. It allows you to see, all right, we got people to the content, but how much of the content do they actually view? How much do they actually stay on there? It's similar to scroll depth in terms of the what it's calculating, but it's very much it can be very much webinar and video based. It can also be ebook and or blogs, if you're able to capture how long they've spent on your ebook or your site, and the average length of time it takes to read your blog post, and you can kind of get a sense of that. I'm not going to cover this too much today, but part of the reason why we're covering all these metrics is so that you can benchmark success. Benchmarking success, you can do it 2 different ways. You can use your own historical data, and by far this is, I find, to be the cleanest way to measure your success. You need to know what you're doing in order to figure out what you need to do better. But sometimes you're starting from scratch. You don't have historical data, or you want to see how you're doing against peers. So benchmarking against industry data points is an important part of this process. And so BrightTALK last in April released our 2021 benchmark report, and in this report we looked at hundreds of thousands of different data points to look to understand really how are marketers creating content, how are professionals engaging with that content. And so what you see here is a kind of combination of those 2 things. And so you saw that, the average created content per month last year, not surprisingly, considering that in-person events went away for most of last year, content creation went up by 86% to 1.6 pieces of content per month. Marketers are creating more content online, not surprisingly. We saw the average registrations were about 120. The completion rate hovered around a little more than half. And again, you'll see the rest. You'll see the average reg to live. So again, people who registered and then attended live, was about 36%, but the average reg to view was about 46%. So still more than half people who register are not going to attend your presentation. That's okay. You got their initial interest, and that's why we're promoting more and more content, because maybe that piece of content wasn't valuable enough to them for them to attend. That's okay. You've already acquired their information. Now it's time to find the right content for them and continually promoting content to them. But it's important to be able to benchmark this, benchmark yourself and your webinar program or your virtual event program. Virtual events are becoming more and more common nowadays, and it's really important that that you're understanding, should you expect when you run these types of events? Because especially with their virtual event, this is a lot of investment into producing this content and putting on an event that, quite honestly, has a lot of moving pieces. Having produced probably 200 or 300 virtual events, between your speaker lineup to promoting the content to the agenda to the internal organization, it's a lot. And so you want to make sure that it's worth it and that you're going to get the volume of leads that you want, and that you have the data to benchmark yourself against. Attribution, I'm not going to cover this too much, but attribution and performance are the last two types of metrics. Attribution is really focusing around the influence your content has and your campaigns have against the buyer's journey. So this isn't looking at the direct results. This isn't looking at conversion rates. This is really looking at, all right, because buyers nowadays don't have a linear path to buying, right? They aren't going immediately to a salesperson to learn from that salesperson to then make an educated decision on what to buy. They're doing all that research beforehand. The digital experience now for buyers is so important. And like I said, it's not linear. It's not, from one piece of content, they're going to go then view this piece of content, then they'll view this piece of content, and then they'll view this piece of content. It just doesn't work that way. People like to be self-guided, want to find want to find the answers first before they come talk to a salesperson. And so, looking at attribution is an important part of that. Last touch attribution is probably the most common one I see. This is by last touch attribution. This means this is the last content that a professional or lead accessed before filling out a form or some kind of call to action. Reporting on this tends to be in pipeline contribution or campaign contribution. So it tends to be monetary. But it allows you to understand, all right, what is the last thing someone viewed in order to convert someone? And it really tells you the right converting content that you have within your content stack. First touch attribution is, not surprising, the first touch. So it's the first piece of content that you use to acquire that audience member or that lead. It tells you what your best acquisition content is. It allows you to know, all right, what pieces are allowing you to get that volume of leads, but doesn't necessarily tell you what that journey is for that lead. It doesn't tell you much more after that first touch, because that the journey with a buyer, it could be a few days, it could be a few months. And if someone viewed content 12 months ago and they still haven't bought with you, but they're about to buy now, looking at first touch doesn't really help you. It's interesting, but it doesn't really give you more than, all right, we found this guy or this woman, from this channel, at this point, but how they got to buying, you lose all of that with first touch. Well, sales converting content, this is really like enablement content. So looking at what type of enablement content, things like case studies, consideration, product comparison documents are interesting. Something we've been measuring more and more is which assets are being used by sales teams in order to, and that are generating basically results, so that we can really understand, all right, when salespeople, provide this case study, this ideal customer profile, we're seeing, slightly higher conversions here, or which pieces of content, quite honestly, aren't performing, or if we get negative feedback on. Lastly, multi-touch attribution. So, this takes the strengths of last touch and first touch, but looks at every single touch that a lead has against your content and weights it depending on how you want to weight it. It could be evenly, it could be not, but looking at and understanding, all right, how does content influence across a journey over time? So, looking at multi-touch attribution, we can see, which pieces of content were best for acquiring, while also helping nurture through before converting in terms of the last touch. So it gives you kind of this fuller picture, and allowing you to weight different content pieces and different parts of your journey depending on your needs. Multi-touch attribution is the one that we are using the most. It's how we measure our campaign influence for content. It's really a powerful tool for us because, again, a buyer will go and view about 3 to 4 pieces of content before making a buying decision. And so understanding what the 3 to 4 and how that influences from acquiring, nurturing to converting is important. And then finally, performance metrics. So, performance metrics are really kind of the business impact, the direct business impact in the bottom line. These are the ones that you guys probably know the best. They are things like leads created. The volume of leads created per asset is important, because if you aren't creating leads from your content, there's really no value in you creating that content. The whole point of you generally creating content tends to be, most of the time, is for lead creation. But MQLs, right? Understanding how marketing qualified leads fit based off certain criteria, a certain level of engagement that are ready to be passed on, is important, and be able to measure and quantify that. This could be one of your goals. This is a very, very common goal I see. Outside of leads created, MQLs, right? Do they fit the ideal customer profile, and have they engaged at some point with our brand or within a certain topic, is important. It's all about that balancing between quantity and quality. Bookings influenced, right? The amount of booking pipeline contribution from marketing, how many leads were sourced and therefore, pipeline contributed from those leads, is an important metric. It goes closer and closer to the bottom line in terms of how you're making an impact in terms of sales. It does create better, alignment between sales and marketing. So these are metrics that both teams are looking at on a day-to-day basis. Revenue influenced or contributed. This is what I'm seeing more and more common. And there's a lot of information out there about marketers being asked to become more revenue generating, and it's true. Marketing is all about spending money and spending resources in order to get return. And so, understanding how your content influences and generated, close one bookings is important. I don't think I'll be honest, I don't think it's the most important. I do think pipeline and booking influenced makes more sense to me, because a lot of the time with sales, with the revenue contribution, it's really up on the salesperson to follow up on the lead on a timely manner with the right content, provide the right solution. There's a lot of steps from where you generated, interest and got them to, join a meeting, all the way to buying. And so, there's some pros and cons with revenue, but quite honestly, sometimes you don't have a choice and you do have to measure it. But from that, you also, again, we've already talked about content ROI, but again, this is all about, right, what's your impact? How much money is coming in from what you have outputted? And then finally, customer acquisition cost. This is something that BrightTALK is working towards right now, but understanding how much it takes, how much it costs to acquire a new customer, looking at everything from the marketing expenses, the sales expenses, finance, all the touch points and human factors as well as tools, but really understanding all that goes into acquiring a customer, and then the lifetime value of that customer, right, are really important metrics that tell you, are you upselling and growing your business? But they're the most complicated to get to. And so, it really just depends on, what data you currently have and what your currently set up is in order to get to that. Now, over the last few minutes, I just want to give you a few tips from BrightTALK's journey to implementing content analytics and how we measure performance. This isn't easy. There's a lot of data out there. It's really easy to get lost in the sea of data and metrics, and try and really measure everything. And that can quite be detrimental to your operations. And so there's a few tips I want to provide before we wrap up for today, around how you can kind of get started, as well as how you can choose the right metrics and goals for your organization. So first and foremost, start with what you can measure. If you don't have access to some data, then you can't measure it. And so there's no point in measuring it. So you have to start off small. Start off with what you can do. If all you have is Google Analytics and email marketing platform, use that. It's still valuable data. Is it the most valuable data? Not necessarily, but it's still data that you can use to inform your insights. Understanding the underlying behavior from your audience. What are you trying to optimize for? What is the behavior you're looking for? Are you finding that when you get only registrations, for example, that's not enough to send to the sales team because they're not converting? Do you need them to get views? Do they have to view a certain amount of content? What is the behaviors you're looking for that you're trying to optimize for? And really focusing on that, because you need to make sure that you're, and I'll cover in a second, but you need to make sure you are focusing on 1 to 2 metrics at most. So, but then again, you want to make sure your goals are smart. This means that they are, they are relatable, they are accessible, that you can measure them, they're actionable. There's no point in making a goal around something that you can't measure or isn't specific enough. So you having very specific goals will help you have kind of hyper diligence within your team around figuring out, all right, should you do this or that? Well, is it going to make impact on this KPI? Yes or no? If it doesn't, then don't do it. And that's leading with my last tip is, identify a single key metric for hyper-focused optimization. It's really impossible to optimize content around around multiple metrics. Because again, content could have one purpose, could have multiple, but also you can't try and do too much with content. So while some content can acquire and convince professionals, that doesn't happen too often. And so you really need to understand what's the goal of your content. If it's to acquire, then you need to be focusing on, maybe focusing on reach. You need to focusing on, channel optimization. You need to be looking around email open rates and click-through rates. If it's around viewership and engagement, and you need to focus on, volume of content, you think you can look at, volume of content engaged. You look, these are all the types of metrics that you can explore, but you need to focus on 1 or 2 of them. I'm not saying that you shouldn't report on more. Oftentimes there are kind of secondary, tertiary metrics that do help provide color and tell the story a little bit fuller. But in terms of how to optimize and really report on, you need to make sure there's hyper focus and that everyone understands this is what the goal is. And on that note, that's all for what we have for today. Now, there are a few questions out there. So the first question is, how do you track time on page? So time on page typically is tracked through some kind of website traffic tool. Google Analytics, probably by far the most common, but there are, a number of tools out there in order to measure this. It's a pretty common metric. So I see many different content analytic platforms out there measure this pretty, by standard. But it is one of those metrics that can be measured as long as you have those, the tools set up. And on that note, that's all the questions for today. Thank you for attending the 5th episode of the Content Intelligence series. I hope you found the content valuable in what we discussed today. If you did find value, please give me a rating and any feedback through the player at the very bottom. If you didn't, please also give me feedback. Everything is read and appreciated. We are looking for future topics to be covered in this series. So if you do have any recommendations on topics you'd like us to see covered, please use the comments and feedback functionality, and we'll review this as we start planning for future episodes. Before we go, you can find some additional resources in the attachments section button in your player that should help with your content strategy, planning, and execution. And with that, my name is Nick Markwith, and have a great day. Thank you.